This is part two in the series on how to use the DBX runner service to automate your execution of the queues created in the DBX data management application. So I'm looking at the services that are currently available on my system, and if I refresh this list, I don't really see the DBX runner service available yet, as I haven't configured it to work on this machine for this video. So later on we should be able to see the DBX runner service available in this list of services. So let's take a look at what we can do to set up the DBX runner service. So on the machine where you have installed DBX, within the installation folder you should see two batch files, one called install runnerservice.bat and uninstall runnerservice.bat. Whenever you need to run any of these two batch files, you need to make sure that you're running them as administrator. One way to do that would be to right click on the file and select run as administrator. Since we haven't installed the service yet on this machine, we can start installing it by once again right clicking on it and selecting run as administrator. So we are prompted by the service installer to provide the login that will be used by the service. In this case, I'll just be providing my local login and the password. Now if you are in a domain, for example, if you are in a domain and this is a network login, then you need to specify a domain name. But in my case, this username is just a local user. One consideration though, as far as if you need to use a local user or a network login, is dependent on the resources that is going to be accessed by your DBX processes. For example, if you have a process that's set to import contacts into your Goldmine system from a file that is on the network, then you need to make sure that you're going to specify a username here that will have proper access to that network location where the file might be located. Also, make sure that this username that you're setting up have access to the network copy of Goldmine. If Goldmine is installed, for example, on the network somewhere on the G drive, maybe G Goldmine, that this user have access to that particular folder. Otherwise, the service itself will fail to execute the processes. Everything right now, however, is local to this machine. So I can simply click OK to complete the installation of the service. So now we should be able to look at the services and refresh the display. Notice that now we have a DBX service runner service, and by default it's going to be on manual. You most likely need to set this up as automatic, since if in case the machine where DBX is currently running on is rebooted, maybe due to power failure or a Windows update, or somebody really needs to restart the computer, then setting it up as a startup type automatic will ensure that the service will automatically start and there will be no disruption as far as the scheduled execution of the queues that are set up in the application. The next step there would then be to start the service. So you can maybe just right click on it and click start. Before we do that, I'd like to review a few more settings just to make sure that we have set up this correctly. For example, if you go to the DBX runner service.exe.config and edit the file, maybe using your favorite text editor, in my case, that would be edit notepad++. So the interesting portions of this would be things that are in the connection string section, and just simply scroll to the right and confirm that you have the proper connection strings. So if you scroll further down, you will notice that you will have a section called app settings, and take note of these three keys. The first setting is enable logging. What this means is that when the service is running, it's going to create a file that will create log details about things that the service is doing. For example, it's scanning for active queues, when the last time that it scanned for a queue, and if there are any error messages. The next option is the log folder. This will be the folder where the log files will be saved. The files will be relatively small, so it shouldn't be a concern as to if it was on your C drive or D drive. The only suggestion is it'd be better if you have it locally. That way, the logging will be able to save it the quickest way possible, as opposed to having the service go to the network just to save a file. The other option here is the timer interval. It's defaulted to 300,000 seconds. That would be 5 minutes. This is the amount of time between when it scans for a queue that needs to be executed. So by default, if you just simply ran the service after we have installed it, then it would not be creating a log, and it will start scanning for queues that needs to be executed every 5 minutes. So for example, the current time is 12:05, and you have something that you have scheduled to run at 12:06. The last scan time done by the DBX or service, for example, is also 12:05. So the next time that it will scan for another queue that needs to be executed is at 12:10. So obviously, the queue that's scheduled at 12:06 will not be executed really at 12:06. It will be executed immediately once 12:10 comes in. So it will look at queues that needs to be executed or should have been executed but haven't been executed yet, so that it can catch up with the scheduled queues that needs to be run. You can change the interval to, maybe in this case, 60 seconds if you want it to scan every minute. Unless you need something that's more near real time, then you can set this interval to a smaller increment. However, that would also mean that it would be scanning the DBX database more frequently. That shouldn't be an issue. However, that can still take some time slice out of your SQL Server, assuming that the Goldmine SQL Server is the one used to host the DBX databases. Otherwise, if it has its own SQL Server, for example, you are using SQL Server Express 2012 dedicated to the DBX databases, then this shouldn't be a concern. If the installation folder for DBX is in the C program files folder, you may need to run your text editor as an administrator before you open the text file. Otherwise, any changes that you do will not be saved. Also, if you have made changes to the config file within this section, you need to restart the service to see these settings take into effect. And once you have finished setting this up, you have identified if you wanted to enable logging, where you want to save the log files, and the interval between each scan for active queues or queues that needs to be executed. Then you can go back to the services and execute the DBX service runner. And from that point forward, you don't really need to revisit setting up the DBX service runner anymore, because it just needs to be set up once and it should continue to scan and monitor your queues within DBX. When you need to maintain your queues, however, within DBX, what you might want to do is disable the queue if you need to work on the processes within that queue. So you uncheck active and click save. This way, you're ensuring that this queue will not be executed by the runner service by accident when you are making changes to how the process is going to work. For example, you're changing a setting in the import, for example, and you're changing field mappings. You don't want the runner service to execute the queue, which will eventually run the process, if you are in the middle of changing the settings. So it's really important that before you work on any process that are included in that queue, that you deactivate the queue. Once you're done, you can always set it to active and click save. If you think that you need to run the queue because it was skipped by the service, then you can manually run it by clicking on queue options, and you can click on run queue. Otherwise, you can just let the queue run the next time that the runner service identifies that the queue was skipped in the previous scheduled time period, and that it will still execute it the next interval. If you have any questions regarding the steps taken in this video, or questions on how to set up a specific scenario for your use, please feel free to send it to support@dbxforgoldmine.com.